What is up, people, and welcome to my ranking of the 7 Resident Evil movies that we currently have. That is the 6 Paul W.S. Anderson films, as well as the brand new film that came out this weekend, Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City. This is a guilty pleasure franchise for me. For a context of video game fandom, Resident Evil is my favorite video game franchise. I grew to absolutely fall in love with it about 2005 when Resident Evil 4 came out. I have played all of the previous games. After I got hooked on it with Resident Evil 4, I've played every chapter since as far as the main games. And it's just one of those franchises that I can endlessly go back and keep replaying these games, like Resident Evil 4, dozens of times and still get the same amount of enjoyment out of it. So I do go into these movies as a fan of the games with certain preconceived expectations, with certain things that I want to see, certain respect that I want to be paid out of them. And it goes without saying that the first 6 movies don't exactly do that, but I've always had guilty pleasure with those movies for the surface value entertainment that they deliver. So where do all 7 of these movies stack against each other? Let's get into it now. So the bottom of the barrel, the worst of this franchise by a country mile, is Resident Evil: The Final Chapter. This is a movie that I reviewed very early on in this channel. I did not like when I first saw it, and I thought that maybe time, distance, healing a little bit of wounds would make me appreciate it maybe slightly more, or at least be able to digest it a little bit better years later, watching it for the second time just a couple of weeks ago. And I hated this thing even more after watching the first 5 movies and then going into this one. This is just an absolutely incompetent movie. It does come to somewhat of a conclusion, so I mean, at least their final chapter, the final movie bullshit that usually is the kiss of death for a final movie in a horror franchise is true. It is the final chapter. But beyond all of that, and beyond the pretty good performance that we get from the main villain here, everything else is just baffling. I mean, from the way that they shot the action and the way that they especially edited the action to where everything is shot from multiple angles and chopped and hacked up and thrown together in the editing room, to where every single action sequence in this movie is incomprehensible. Your eyes cannot even keep up with what you are looking at, because it's just constantly changing views and switching back and forth. And even a simple scene like Alice shooting at one monster, it just goes back and forth from their 2 perspectives with every single gunshot, like almost 95 something cuts within like a 6-second scene, to where it's just everything, you can't value any of the action, which is, by this point, really the only thing that you can value in this franchise, because they never really nail the horror, and they don't really bother themselves with being true to the video game storylines, and the storylines they do give you are very bare bones, especially these last 3 movies in that franchise. So the one thing that you might be able to get some entertainment value by this point in the franchise, they absolutely decimate in the editing room. Beyond all that, the story, the retcons, the logic gaps, so much in this movie just insults your intelligence as a human being, to where it feels like they put no time, no effort whatsoever into this script. Like they just got approved for a budget, threw something together in a weekend, and churned out the laziest piece of shit that they could to make a quick profit and be done with this franchise once and for all. And that's insulting to me, not only as a Resident Evil fan, but as a movie audience member. So this movie can go fuck itself. I hate it. Number 6 is Resident Evil Retribution. Now, while not necessarily being leaps and bounds better than Final Chapter, at least you can watch this one and comprehend what you're watching. They do this story where they basically retcon the end of the 4th film and just get rid of anything that we achieved by that one, just to start their own storyline again regarding all of these underground biomes, which is the one element of the movie that I really liked, that you get like a Moscow, Russia biome, you get a suburban America, all these different little areas that gives the movie a different visual flair and a bit of a variety for the action and for the settings that you're going throughout. They try to put as many classic Resident Evil characters in here as they possibly can, both from the video games as well as this movie franchise, by reviving dead characters, but they fall flat on their face in both respects, because the video game characters that they bring in, they put no effort whatsoever into making those characters like their actual characters. They're just characters in name and look only. And then you have all the returning characters from the previous Resident Evil movies that are dead and gone and now been revived as clones, that they don't even do anything with them. They just show up for a few familiar face scenes, and then that's about it. Story-wise, they have no place whatsoever in the plot. So even if you're just a fan of this movie franchise, you're kind of annoyed and insulted with the fact that they didn't bother to do anything meaningful with that. And then yet again, they end this movie with this huge promise for a final film for this epic battle in Washington, D.C. with all the surviving characters against this huge, massive wave of Umbrella bioweapons, just for them to wipe the slate clean and not give us even a single scene of that in the next film. So this movie to me is pretty much useless. Now for context, I can enjoy every other movie on this list. The bottom two are the only ones that I never really have an interest in watching or talking about again. Everyone on here, while not being great movies from here on up, are movies that I do get enjoyment out of. So with that being said, number 5 is going to be Resident Evil Afterlife. Now, this is a movie that I enjoyed a lot when I saw it in theaters. I saw it with my brother. We were big fans of Resident Evil 5 at the time, which this movie takes a lot of inspiration from visually, with characters, with a little bit of story plot here and there. And of the Resident Evil movies that I enjoy, this is the one that has the most surface level enjoyment that I can have, which is just some cool visuals, some cool action scenes. There's really nothing here as far as plot. You come up with a reason after the end of the third film to get rid of that plot point very quickly, which is something that they started to do all the way through the end of this franchise. And then they just kind of meander around with characters that you know and some new characters that you know from the video games while they're trying to get to this boat. So the whole movie, plot-wise, story-wise, really has nothing to give whatsoever. It's just watching Alice kick ass once again. Watching her and a bunch of clones in a really cool sequence that was a bit of a missed opportunity. That was only one sequence where they raid Umbrella, and then you have her fighting some friends that are controlled by the mind by Umbrella with these little scarab things from Resident Evil 5. Then you have zombies breaking into this place a la Dawn of the Dead remake, this little tower that they are in. And then eventually fight scenes like a big boss battle with Wesker. So if you can enjoy just individual action sequences that don't necessarily tie together in a very satisfying way, this movie is a guilty pleasure. This movie is something that you can pop on and enjoy to certain degrees as a Resident Evil fan. As a movie, it's not that great. Coming in at number 4 is going to be Resident Evil Extinction. Now, I often go back and forth between Extinction and Afterlife as far as which one that I like more. I think that the individual sequences in Afterlife are better than the individual sequences in Extinction. But Extinction feels like it has a little bit more of a flow to it, a little bit more of a storyline, and I like the visual aesthetic of like the Mad Max post-apocalyptic world that they're going for. So as of right now, I enjoy this one just slightly better. I think that they kind of jumped the gun going from the end of Apocalypse to now a barren, sand-covered wasteland that is Earth. I think that's a little ridiculous, but nonetheless, this franchise is ridiculous. So you get past that, and essentially you have Alice roaming the Earth by herself, while the other remaining characters, save for Sherry Birkin, who we get no explanation for, is just kind of surviving in these little encampments, trying to find gasoline, trying to find resources, much like Mad Max. And so there's a lot of cool action sequences here regarding like these demonic crows that are terrorizing everybody, that are undead, trying to pick everybody clean, and some of Alice's powers are on display much more in this movie, which leads to some interesting visuals. There's some decent character interaction here as far as bringing in Claire Redfield, who is one of the least egregious of bringing a character from the video game and not really giving them the personality or the story of the video games, but she does okay. Carlos comes back, I like his character. They completely waste Mike Epps as LJ. I thought he was a really good addition to the second movie, and here he has this plot point about hiding a bite, and that's about all they give him. He's not even a comedic relief in this movie, which, why you hire Mike Epps to be anything other than a comedic relief, beyond fucking me. And you do get a fight with the Tyrant in this movie, which is one of the better game translations of a villain, of a big bioweapon boss, in my opinion, that we've gotten in these 6 Paul W.S. Anderson movies. So overall, it's a movie that I definitely don't think is among the best of this franchise, obviously, but if I was to put it on, like most of the movies that I'm talking about, I could have some entertainment with it. I think it's a decent post-apocalyptic zombie movie. Coming in at number 3 for me is the original Resident Evil. Now, this is a movie that has a lot of nostalgia power for me. This came out at a time where I had not even experienced the games yet, so this was kind of my first dip into the Resident Evil world was what this movie gave me. And boy, the shock after I got the experience of the video games and realized how far off this movie actually was. But being that I was able to see this with a clean mind and just walk into this expecting a cool B-movie action horror zombie thing, I think that it holds up pretty decently here. While this movie unfortunately took the deliberate approach to distance itself entirely from the video games by not having any characters from the video games here, by not having any specific settings or storylines that's carried from the video games, it kind of just takes inspiration from Resident Evil and does a complete unique thing with the story. I think what it does is an entertaining enough early 2000s horror film. You've got Milla Jovovich here, which I haven't spoke on specifically, but for context, I do like her character of Alice. She's certainly not the best character that Resident Evil has ever given us, and I wish that she didn't take the spotlight from beloved characters so much throughout the franchise, but for what this character is, somebody with amnesia that wakes up in this larger-than-life situation and slowly throughout these movies gains more powers, more fighting, more heroism, I think that she's a pretty good leading character for the type of movies that they're going for, and that certainly rings true for this first film. There's a lot of memorable sequences here, especially the laser sequence. I mean, it's such a standout sequence that 2 other movies in this franchise revisit that, maybe even 3, I might even be forgetting one, but they know that was a flagship scene in this first movie, and it's, to me, the best scene of the film, even to the point where Resident Evil 4 took inspiration from the movie and put a laser grid scene in the actual game. I think that some of the reveals regarding who let the virus out works pretty well. Even the characters of like Matt and the little dynamic that him and Alice have throughout the movie where they're kind of thrown into the situation unwillingly and they kind of band together through that works pretty well. Some of the CGI, some of the early designs and early effects of these creatures aren't the best. They get way better just even in the second movie onward. But as a 2000s B-movie level zombie action horror film, it's entertaining. Now, I gotta be honest, these top 2 might be the most like toss it up in the air and decide one kind of decision that I have ever had to make for a ranking in the 6+ years that I have had this channel. Usually I have a definitive, passionate view on what is my top movie, and at best, if I don't have that, I have 2 movies that are neck and neck with how awesome that they are that you could pretty much, they could tie for number 1. That's not really the case here. Even the best of this franchise ranking are just good movies, okay movies, guilty pleasure movies. Nothing that the Resident Evil franchise has given us on the movie screens I would call a great, awesome, commendable horror film yet. Hopefully yet. But you have these 2 films that are left, Resident Evil Apocalypse and the new film Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City. And on one hand, I have a movie that gives me very surface level action, horror, guilty pleasure that I think has a lot of fun moments, has a lot of very cool callbacks to the video games that aren't exactly the most brilliant translation of those video games, but are still a fun version to have on the movie screens. And then you have a movie that is absolutely bathed in love letter to fandom of this franchise, but really drops the ball in the story department. Not that this one's a whole lot better in the story department, but this to me felt like a more coherent story, a more coherent movie in Apocalypse, to where Welcome to Raccoon City has a little bit more jumbled mess aesthetic to it and how they're presenting these characters in the story. So pretty much how I landed with where my number 2 is, as of right now, it's going to be Resident Evil Apocalypse. And the way that I decided is that if I was presented right now, if the movie studios pulled up to my house and, black suits and sunshades and said, look, we can erase the entire Resident Evil franchise of the past 6 films and give you an awesome follow-up to Resident Evil Apocalypse that's even better than that movie, or we can do what we already started with Welcome to Raccoon City and give you an awesome follow-up to this movie, which one would you rather have? And I would easily choose this camp. So number 2, Resident Evil Apocalypse, to me, is the best that we ever got out of the Paul W.S. Anderson films. To me, this one is the most like the video games in visual, in story, in characters, in the villains. To me, it pays the most respect to the video games because this is quite literally a translation of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis on the big screen. and I think they do a pretty good job with that. It's not 100% how I would like it if I was in charge, but for what we got, I have always been entertained by this movie. This is the one Resident Evil movie previous to the new one that if I was ever in a mood for this film franchise, I would almost always grab that one. I would even skip over the first one and just go straight to this one because the action is better, the characters are better, the budget is certainly better, the way that they realize the villains, namely Nemesis, the effects, and the way that they portray that character, certainly a lot better than what we got in the first film. There's comedy here to break it up with Mike Epps' character. There's some really good action and fighting where Alice is now superhuman because of what has happened to her by the end of the first film. So overall, aside from all of the same things that I bitched about with all these movies to a much lesser degree, with the story not necessarily being the best, with there certainly being some cheating and not the most respectful translations of video game characters into the movie universe, and being a B-movie guilty pleasure movie at its heart, I think that this movie is just really entertaining. So if I'm in an action mood, if I'm in a mood to just have this explosive experience in the Resident Evil franchise, this is the one that I will go to even over my number one. But for me, number one is Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City by a nose, by a razor thin margin. And I really hope that it was not going to be that way. I hope that I'd watch this movie and say that is easily the best thing that we've ever gotten from this franchise. And maybe go as far as to say that is easily the best video game adaptation we've ever gotten. Didn't quite get there. But what this movie did give me, as a Resident Evil fanatic, as somebody that is very knowledgeable of the stories, of the lore, of the characters, of the settings, of the visuals, everything from the video games, this movie was an absolute gift-wrapped present to me. Unfortunately, they didn't really give a fuck about anybody beyond people like me, so there's a lot of people like my buddy Sean Chandler that walks into this with very little to no knowledge of all the things that I just described. All of the Easter eggs, all of the character dynamics, all of the damn near perfect recreations of the video game settings, like the entrance to the Spencer Mansion, like the hallway with all the artwork, like the entrance to the Raccoon Police Department. All of that just perfectly recreated goes completely over those people's heads because unfortunately they just don't have the experience and the context to appreciate all of that. So as a fan, all of that stuff, all the effort that they put into to making this 100% for Resident Evil fans, I adored from start to finish. I laughed, I smiled ear to ear, I was pointing at the screen, I was like, yes, they finally fucking did it. Yes, they did that. Yes, he's playing Moonlight Sonata. All these things that, from the decades of experience that I've had with these video games, just touched my heart, makes me love the direction that they're going with this franchise, despite having a very rocky start. And where the rocky start pretty much comes from is the unfortunate decision that they made to do the story of Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 2 within the same exact movie, when you could easily have a very difficult job translating just one of those and not omitting things that's going to upset fans or not omitting things that makes the story work in its own movie. So putting them together just felt like an exercise in futility to me. A few of the creative choices that they made regarding characters, namely Leon, who they make a moron in this, Wesker, who they make pre-villainous Wesker in the story that he is supposed to be the main villain. The way that they utilized Lisa Trevor, which was one of the biggest genuine surprises and shocks to me when I saw the first still image, was like, holy shit, they're gonna bring her in, that's gonna be terrifying. And they kind of make her a bit of a good guy here. Like, to me, those three things were such giant missteps in characters to where the amount of love and attention and just full-on respect that they pay to all of the pre-existing lore and characters in the franchise love that all of us fans have, that felt like the complete opposite to me, which was weird to have in the same movie. And as far as the story, because they are building both of these stories together simultaneously with two different casts, it feels like they're constantly battling for attention this entire movie, and neither one really reaches the level of tension, the level of detail, or the level of fleshing out these character dynamics that either of these stories deserve. Beyond all of that, I think all the other casting, all of the other story directions, all of the other character directions that they take was spot on. I loved Chris Redfield. I loved Claire Redfield here. I thought that William Birkin, despite not being utilized to his full potential, was a really fun version of that character. I thought that having Chief Irons, who is a kind of a different interpretation of that character, was the most fun person in the entire movie. You got Donald Logue here. He was an absolute blast. I thought that the way that they built up the tension regarding specific isolated scenes where like Chris Redfield's in a hallway and he's shooting at like 7 or 8 different zombies and the only lighting you get is the muzzle flashes. That made me feel like I was playing the original game again and just confined in this claustrophobic hallway with all the undead coming at me, and that was awesome. All the Easter eggs, talking about the Ashford twins, showing the keys, 100% recreating the childlike artwork on the Raccoon City orphanage, the dying woman writing itchy tasty on the window with blood, even silly ones like Jill grabbing Wesker's sandwich and saying this is a Jill sandwich now. Like, stuff like that is just so on the nose. And saying, here fans, we heard you for the last 15 years that we made those movies, bitching completely over and over and over again about how we weren't respecting you, how we weren't making these movies for you, how we were giving you the big middle finger. This movie rectified all of that. So by the end of it, despite not being a perfect experience, despite unfortunately being a movie that I would never recommend to anybody that's not a Resident Evil fan, and that's a shame, despite being a movie that certainly should not have been 2 stories in one, I had a really good time with this one. And if we are able to get a sequel to this, if it does make enough money, if it does get enough of a following, I really look forward to where they're going to be taking this franchise, and I will be there with bells on. And I could never really necessarily say that about the Paul W.S. Anderson movies. I was like, if this is it, that's fine. I'll have fun with these. If we get another one, I'll probably go check that one out too. But it was never out of excitement. I'm excited about this. So that is my ranking of the 7 Resident Evil movies, guys. Let me know down below what your ranking is, and let me know where you are as far as a Resident Evil fan. Have you only watched the movies? Have you only played 1 or 2 of the games? Or have you been a lifelong fanatic? Because I think that, more than anything else, is going to give a lot of context and a lot of explanation to where a lot of our rankings differ and which ones are similar. So let me know down below, guys, and we will talk about it. Please like and share this video and hit that subscribe button. If you are a fan of Resident Evil, I have a ton of Resident Evil content on this channel. I reviewed the 7th game, I reviewed the 8th game, I have ranked the games a couple different times, I have ranked the bosses, I've ranked some of the characters, and of course I've reviewed every single movie in the Resident Evil world, now ending with this ranking. And we are not done by a long shot, because I am about 1/3 of the way through Resident Evil 4 VR on the Oculus Quest, and you know I'm going to be talking about that on this channel at some point. So, if you're a fan, hit the subscribe button so you do not miss any of that. Thank you guys for watching, as always, and remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean that you have to be.